Good evening from the Institute of Human Sciences in Vienna, and a warm welcome to everyone who is watching us on live stream. As you probably all know, Austria is in full lockdown from this morning, and we are able to do events but without the public. But we're very glad that we are able to hold these colloquia. And today I have the special honor as the acting rector, and my name is Ivan Vejvoda, to introduce this panel on the death and rebirth of democratic internationalism with Professor Micheline Ishay from the University of Denver in Colorado, where she leads as the director of the International Studies program at the Joseph Corbell Institute of International Studies. If you allow me a small biographical note, Joseph Corbell was the ambassador of Czechoslovakia in Yugoslavia, and my late father was the assistant minister then, and I have many photos at home of the two of them together. Of course, the other piece that you all know is that Madeleine Albright is the daughter of Joseph Corbell, and she was a young girl in the Czechoslovak embassy in Belgrade. So as trivia goes, I don't think that's a bad one. We will have comments from Professor Claus Offe, who's a permanent fellow with the Institute, and my colleague, permanent fellow at the IWN, Professor Ludgar Hagedorn, will be moderating the event. Over to you, Ludger.
Thank you, Ivan. I will remain seating. Good evening also from me. Ludgar Hagedorn, I'm a permanent fellow at the Institute. It seems that we are living in times where we are facing many global challenges, economic challenges, a growing social divide, environmental challenges, frightening developments in terms of climate change, and over recent months, a public health emergency on a so far unseen scale. Not to mention all the challenges related to technological innovations, artificial intelligence, bioengineering. So it seems there is a lot to do for international solutions, many tasks for internationalism, but unfortunately internationalism is not in such a good shape as we all would want to be it. Micheline Ishay, our speaker of today, has announced this in her title by speaking about the death of democratic internationalism. But this, for today, will not be her last word. The title speaks about the death and the rebirth of democratic internationalism, and the task of her talk will be to give us an idea of how this could come about and how to reinvigorate policies promoting global governance in relation to a respect for universal human rights. My colleague Ivan Vejvoda has already briefly introduced both of you. I'm most happy that you're both joining us for this talk today. I will only do a very short introduction of both speakers of today, and please allow me to do it in reverse order today for two reasons. The first reason is out of respect and reverence for our permanent fellow at the Institute, Claus Offe, whom we are very happy to have here as a guest this month. And secondly, this also allows me, Micheline, at the end of my introduction, to immediately give the word to you. So, Professor Claus Offe, we are happy to call him a permanent fellow colleague here at the Institute for Human Sciences since 2015. He's also a member of our academic advisory board. One of the best known, internationally renowned scholars in the field of political sociology, teaching for many, many years at German universities, where he showed a certain like for cities starting with a B. He has been teaching at the universities of Bielefeld, of Bremen, and in Berlin. In Berlin at the Humboldt University, and lately also at the Hertie School of Governance. Claus Offe has been a fellow to very many most renowned international institutions, It is a long list of the best-known places: Princeton, Harvard, Berkeley, the New School, and you have also been a fellow at the Australian National University. In the beginning, Claus Offe was quite strongly influenced by the Frankfurt School, by Habermas especially, but over the years I think he has also dared to have quite many of his own points of view on topics. Claus Offe is happy to already look on a edition of collected volumes of his writings. 6 volumes have come out already between 2018 and 2020, and I would like to only mention one of his recent publications, Europa in der Falle, Europe Trapped, a book that came out with Surkamp in 2016. Lately, he has also been an advocate of unconditional basic income. This is one of the issues that he has been really fighting for, and he's engaged as an honorary member on a board that is dedicated to that is called the Basic Income Earth Network. Claus, we are very happy and honored that you're here tonight and that you will give this comment on Micheline's talk. Micheline Ishay has already been introduced, working at the University of Denver. She's the director of the International Human Rights Program, IBIDEM, a political scientist known for her work in the field especially of international relations and human rights, and I may add for the interconnection of both fields, internationalism and human rights, or the interconnection of international relations and human rights. And you have also written largely on one region, that is the Middle East, a region where you have also been working and living and dedicated much of your research to. We are happy to have you as a guest at the Institute in November, for this November. And allow me to mention 2 publications. The first one from 1995, a title that is closely connected to today, Internationalism and Its Betrayal. So something announced 25 years ago that you will come back to tonight in some sense. And lately, 2019, this is the other topic that I mentioned, the Middle East, the Levant Express, the Arab Uprising, Human Rights and the Future of the Middle East. Micheline, we are happy to have you for this talk. Please.
Thank you very much for this introduction, the reference to the Korbel School, and lovely to be here in Vienna, a wonderful city, the first day of the lockdown, but we try to make the best out of it. I am going to talk today about the death and rebirth of democratic internationalism, controversies and possibilities. This talk is, as it was just suggested, was drawn from a number of writing I had done in the past. 15 years ago, I was contemplating the burial of internationalism already, once it was announced after the Cold War, and I've written since then on the history of human rights, from the ancient time to the present, and thank you for bringing up the recent book on the Levant Express. Here it's a book where I focus mainly on just not only the Arab uprising and how it derailed, but a number of social, political, economic proposals that could be used for rerouting the future of the Middle East. But then upon reflection, I realized that rerouting those proposals to better future would be a very difficult enterprise if one was not to think more broadly about the international context and about the custodian of the international liberal order and what could be done in this respect. And so that takes me to this effort, first iteration of this effort, looking from now onward. We are in the wake of a crisis since the end of the Cold War, the neoliberal internationalism that was celebrated by Francis Fukuyama in 1989, and soon after is dead today. But we have also reached now about 5 million deaths worldwide, and the pandemic has revealed more than one faces. Of course, the one of the Janus face is that it has strengthened nationalism. It has widened the economic gap that exists between those who are more wealthy and those who are poor. It has created a sense of vulnerability in all society. But at the same time, there is another face of that. It is, one can see that the pandemic has demonstrated that societies have the capacity to connect and come up with new projects. The pandemic has certainly done that in the field of medicines and in other realms as well. So in order to really speak about this big project, 10,000 kilometers above Earth, I'm just going to help myself with 3 questions. The first question being, how did we past international principles gain traction and supersede nationalism? And what was really the contribution of progressive internationalism worldviews? The second question that will also help me frame this question and find some answer would be, how has the neoliberal order established after the Cold War brought us to this series of crises? And third, what are the possibilities for a more robust internationalism and what could it look like? So going back to the first question. So here's it, internationalism and nationalism. Internationalism can be defined, just for the sake of here the focus of the talk, as an ideology often oriented towards some aspect of universal human rights. It stresses both mutual interest and shared value to counter nationalist trends. And there are a number of internationalist traditions that have shaped different political ideology. We can start it from Kant during the Enlightenment to Karl Marx during the First and Second International, and moving to Woodrow Wilson during the League of Nations, and even to FDR after World War II. But let's last and not to forget also Friedrich Hayek, since he's an Austrian economist, so I'm going to bring up his name, and his proselyte, who from the mid-1917 onward have already announced sort of a neoliberal internationalist phase. Now, it is important to remember that each of these thinkers had something else in mind when they talk about internationalism, and those historical phases did not mean the same things when they occurred historically. But what they all had in common is that their opposition to tribalism and nationalism. At best, what we can see is that internationalism emerged in ideals that may galvanize social action, which can ultimately influence political realm, that could ultimately have impact on the global arena. So whether we look at the Industrial Revolution, we know that the civil society was extremely important in contributing the developments of those international organizations from below. But if we look, for instance, at the period of the post-World War II, we know that there were global governance and global mechanisms that enable lifting states from the devastations of World War II. So there is, internationalism can be understood in the way I talk about that, both from above and from below. Nationalism is usually understood typically as the opposite. It's nemesis of internationalism. It is usually a designation for the primordial or pre-political attachment to ancestral and cultural history, and it tends to manifest itself in reaction mainly to social, economic, and cultural crisis. That's usually when we see this emergence, but also it emerged when the architecture of global alliance erodes or citizens are persuaded that the home front is in danger. So when the global alliance and the big international challenges arrive, there is big crisis internationally in the level of global governments. It is often the case that individuals tend to cling to the familiar, they tend to cling to what they know best, so their culture, their community, what they perceive to be external threat. Intertwined throughout modern history, like a double helix, nationalism and internationalism has evolved in a way sort of dialectically, each reacting to the other, each advancing the other in a way, and addressing the challenges in relation to the predicaments of their time. So today my focus will be on democratic internationalism as an antidote against nationalism. Now what do I mean by that? Well, of course, why democratic internationally? We can say that functionally that very concept is not real because there is no supranational government with the constitutions that are now that is abiding by the rule of law, the separations of power with representations of political party at the global level of governments. Therefore, when I talk about democratic internationalism, I really refer to the concept of democratic, of an ideal that could be achieved, but also looking at the possibility that exists currently that could lead to those, that could match and meet those ideals. So in a broader sense, I'm trying to describe action from below and above that counter illiberal internationalism and promote the collective good. So for the sake of time, I'm not going to talk about all the historical phase, but it suffices to know that there were 4 internationalist phases from the Enlightenment to World War II, and the fourth inaugurated after the post-World War II, was inaugurated after the post-World War II. There was a period called Les 30 Glorieuses, or the Glorious 30, that was sort of named following the end of World War II in France and in many neighboring countries. The idea was that the post-World War II and its global design and political design was to establish a regime that was based on sound financial security and human rights mechanism in an effort to stabilize the lives of people that were living in Europe in particular and have gone through 2 sanguinary world wars. So with the end of the decolonization, other parts of the world would demand to experience a very similar experience that the European did, but most would imitate. Few states would succeed, and generally speaking, many more would fail. In the mid-1970s, now Europe will also experience a certain level of crisis. They experienced stagflation and oil economic crisis with devastating rippling effects for the global South. At the time, both Reagan and Thatcher will come out and emerge as sort of the proselytes or the visionary, if one wants to call it this way, of a neoliberal order that will be embraced later on by the Eastern European and others. But this internationalism that was celebrated by Fukuyama and was celebrated by President Bush would not yield to 30 glorious years, but to 30 years of crisis. And so we are now in this particular moment in time when we have to review the 30 years of crisis. We ask, where did we go wrong? What can we learn from the mistake of the post-1989 world? So there are many explanations to this of how that happened, but we know that the neoliberal phase of internationalism with its new world order of unregulated, privatized globalizations really took hold. It fractured the welfare bedrock of many societies that were built after World War II, and also that notions of human rights that was understood by the Universal Declarations of Human Rights, the indivisible and inalienable family of human rights, ended up being split, fractures, and different people from different political persuasions will acclaim and adopt those notions of right in a way that was no longer indivisible and inalienable. So the notions of an internationalism that emerged after the post-World War II was, I would submit, a thin versions of international order because it was relying mainly on free market economy, but it's also buffeted by the emergence of the information revolution. That particular form of internationalism was not robust enough to absorb an unfolding series of calamities leading to its downfall, and therefore we will see a wave of resurgent nationalism. I would suggest that great social visions, as they appear in other periods, collapse without proper infrastructures and political institutions to support or regulate them. And this is really what the case of the post-1989 historical phase. And what we will see as a result of that is the rise of popular disenchantment, rose with nationalist real wrath, against unfulfilled global promises that ultimately will play in the hands of the rich. Now, we can just let things going this route and it will be spiraling down, or we can simply do what Kant always told us already in Perpetual Peace when he was facing sort of unfolding events after the revolution, and that it's forbidden not to do anything as the world descend into hell. I am paraphrasing loosely what he wrote there. And so that takes us to the third question that I enunciate initially, and that is, after 30 years of crisis and decline, where do we go from here? And so I will argue that this time of great social and technological transformation demand broad global civil action and global governance, which can thrive if informed by historical and philosophical lessons. But I identified 6 critical challenges that will inform a little bit the agenda for a possible new internationalist compact. For the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all this challenge, but simply let you know about what are those maxims that I propose, or the 6 pillars I propose that will be debated and discussed as potential in an internationalist compact. So my first pillar is really how to reclaim democratic internationalism in a nationalist world. Now, we know the problem is clear. Everyone has agreed that the international scene looks grim and global governance is paralyzed. In A Problem of Hell, Samantha Power denounced the long inactions of the United States foreign policy in the face of genocide. Other liberal states were not above reproach. They're similar. They're real culprit in the same sense, not having done anything with regard to mass violations of human rights. After the US debacle in Iraq, we saw a groundswell of opposition that rose against the human and financial cost of humanitarian intervention, but there were very few who asked the following question and consider what will be the consequent cost of isolationism, which is one thing that we have to address these days. So the West, I would suggest, remain asleep as large-scale human rights abuses were swept through the Middle East, most horribly in Syria, Yemen, but also in other far-flung parts of the world, Myanmar, Congo, Ethiopia, Tigray, the Uyghur regions of China, and many more. Now, my task today is not to recount all the absence and the neglect of the liberal society, but to do something a bit different than what was done a few days ago by Mark Leonard, who came here, and sort of acknowledging some of the reality of the dystopia in which we live, trying to look at possibility. What are the possibilities in this particular realm? Well, we know that with the fate of liberal democracy in the US, there are interesting ideas that are to be considered. Macron launched the All-European Intervention Initiative, which is an effort to forge a flexible, cohesive European strategy, including military operations in response to shared threats. Now, the European initiative offers one path toward reconstituting an alliance in defense of shared Western values, but the second would be to reaffirm those values within NATO itself. And this is a problem. One has to understand that. There are problems related to this option because NATO, to regain its status as a powerful force for democracy, needs to be internally also democratic, which it has, unfortunately, the status of its member states shows that they have failed to renew their own commitment to human rights. I here will note Turkey, Hungary, and Poland. For example, they may require their own internal reform before they can contribute to internationalist future. Now, in the United States, there's a new president, Joe Biden, who is attempting to rebuild a new international order, a liberal internationalist foundation. So the question is really, will the US back as an ally to Europeans succeed in developing, again, a new coalition of willing liberal democracy partners? And so for that purpose, there are a lot of proposals on the table that suggest some form of reformations of the United States Security Council, notably the G4 proposals, where the Germans have discussed about adding former members at the Security Councils and having a moratorium with respect to the veto right. Another option could be this argument, of course, is not an easy one because the member of the Security Council don't really want to distribute the veto power. But at the same time, it is an argument to be made that those who are actually sitting at the tables are becoming stakeholders of what potential solution could be, and so adding more members would be a step in the right direction. With respect to civil society, what we see is that in the West, unlike other parts of the world, like the Middle East or Hong Kong, the progressive anti-war movement, which sprang to life during the Vietnam War and outlasted the Cold Wars, has now aligned itself with the populist rights in opposition to the use of force for any purpose, and from my perspective, certainly also from human rights perspective. And that becomes a problem as when we talk about pillar and we're talking about the redevelopment and redefining democratic internationalism, that force of social changes is not there, or is not providing alternative. So my second pillar is the fight for universal right for privacy and free speech in the age of authoritarian and capitalist surveillance. Okay, the problem is known. There are nearly 5 billion internet users, and surveillance is on the rise. As government can surveil and censor and dissent in cyberspace better than ever. Usually China is the culprit in these discussions of widespread mass surveillance. We are almost entered an Orwellian world because the Chinese government have established this unified social credit system to monitor all businesses, individual and organization for their trustworthiness. But more disconcerting is the fact that the Chinese government can also, as they've been exporting AI surveillance to about 63 recipient countries, and many of them are authoritarian governments. Government are not the only one to monitoring the communications and behavior of internet users. Shoshana Zuboff, in a breakthrough books, termed the issue of surveillance in terms of surveillance capitalism to describe the dark, monetized side of data extraction for profit. So the surveillance is there, and now what are the possibilities amidst that level of surveillance? Well, if I want us to remember that artificial intelligence and surveillance are also used for helpful ends, such as extinguishing wildfire, protecting endangered species, preventing crime, and tracking data to resolve regional conflicts. Artificial intelligence has been used. As for the more pernicious application, global civil society has forced some company to admit that they have taken this technology too far. So when IBM, Microsoft, and Amazon have announced to lawmakers that they will stop develop general purpose facial recognition technology, it was because of Black Lives Matter was really putting some pressure on them. So to that extent, we see some of the push of civil society to generate some form of regulation. The EU General Data Protection Regulations is also another step in the direct direction. It went into effect in 2018 with the safeguard to the personal data of individuals in the UE when it process and transfer across all sectors. So when that data protection law do exist, there is a propensity to protect data from foreign governments, but less from corporation and one's own government. So one has to be mindful of that. From this level of civil society, here we see some step, with respect to challenging the surveillance right, certainly in the health department. But when privacy through collective action is present, often the surveillance society can actually monitor the people and the dissent, and usually atomize and parcelize and fractures any form of collective action. Directing digital technology toward human rights will not be easy, but building on burgeoning regulation, a global compact on digital technology and human rights should be developed to counter the spread of worldwide authoritarian technology. This will require that liberal democracy serve as a better example in their own use of their technology, apply trade restrictions on AI that violates human rights, and enforce norms backed by multilateral institutions on the ethical use of digital space and AI. And this takes us to a third pillar, which has been discussed by many, and that is the pillar of the universal right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable development in an age of environmental degradation. Now, we all know the problem, sustainability is clearly not an easy proposition in a world marred by excessive consumptions with polluted rivers and oceans and intensifying climate change that is induced by greenhouse gases. But there are possibilities. We know that there's been sort of a plethora of agreements. Certainly, the 2015 Paris Agreement on climate change was the most inclusive agreement since the 1987 Montreal Protocol, with signatures that included almost all countries. And then the recent joint decarbonization agreement, just to mention a few, between US and China, the two leading sources of greenhouse gases, is really not worthy. It may not be sufficient, but it fuels hope that shared global dangers can override even intense ideological and geopolitical rivalry. Now, we all know that that agreement, the summit of Glasgow, left a lot of people very frustrated because the funding of the transition to a decarbonized world remains challenging, particularly in developing countries. And so recognizing that voluntary pledges will never be enough, there was interesting proposals, such as the one of Jeffrey Sachs, who has proposed that each high-income country could be levied sort of $5 per ton of carbon dioxide emitted, and the upper middle income country would be levied to a higher $2.50 per ton. And these CO2 levies could start as a possible and rise gradually, doubling in 5 years to supply the climate adaptation fund. So those are interesting ideas out at the table that people should reckon with. It is also true that 10 years ago, and I recall when I was in the Middle East, there was a lot of discussions already in Gulf countries about the importance of renewable energy, even in the oil-producing country, such as the GCC. This technology, there's a technological revolution that about renewable energy that has the capacity to create jobs and transform society, redistributing wealth and political power more equitably. So things are out there. It's not just completely under the rug. But civil society, more than anything else, have resulted have done more than any other part of for this agenda, than any other form of movement. It's a long history. It's relatively coherent organizations. It is, despite many differences that existed within the ecologic movement, it has become more unified and more militant since the first Earth Day over 50 years ago. So when Greta Thunberg was coming with 66 million people who rally in Sweden in 2018, that was not the beginning of a climate and or environmental movement. That was an environment movement that already was there a long time ago. But we have to remember that at the 2021 Glasgow summit, a multitude of Gen Z generations protesters gathered to make their voice heard, signaling the heightened awareness of a generation comprising 2.5 billion people. So climate conventions are not new, but they are connected more than any other movement to internationalist action of civil society. And this leads me to my fourth pillar. That is the universal right to development and economic sufficiency in an age of protectionism and widespread global poverty. The problem is known. The divide between the rich and the rest has widened within nearly all countries, as well as between the developed world and the least developed countries. COVID-19 has exacerbated the divide between the rich and the poor. And one could even say that, that as a result of the pandemic, the percentage of the world population in poverty was projected to increase for the first time since 1990, perhaps by as many as 500 million people, or 8% of the world population. So we are in bad times. But there are always possibilities that one needs to refer to and debate. In this world of profit-driven competition and declining welfare, there are interesting proposals out there. So for the first target, for instance, of the Millennium Development Goal was to halve between 1990 and 2015 the portion of people whose income is less than $1.25 a day. Now, the goal was really met 5 years early than expected. So that was promising, as more than 1 billion people were raised from extreme poverty. The percentage of the world population living in extreme poverty fell at that time from 36% in 1990 to less than 10% in 2017. Now today, those numbers and meeting the goals of 2015 is almost impossible, out of reach, as the near end of 2021, already nearly 2 years after the pandemic, show that we really have reached a major setback in this regard. Nonetheless, there are a number of ways to consider raising the floor and lowering the ceiling, and one of the ideas that is out there and is gaining mainstream currency is securing a basic universal income in market economy. We had successful experiment in this regard in a number of cities in the United States, as well as in Canada, Kenya, Finland, and so forth. But what we learned from those experiments is that overall people did not stop working or become lazy as a result of subsistence income. So it's worth here to mention the work of Claus Offe, of course, on that subject of universal basic income. He, along with other colleagues like Philippe van Parijs and Yannick van der Boot, had argued that actually this proposition can be understood at the broader global level, a global universal basic income. In such a system, would require periodic cash payments and conditionally delivered to all on an individual basis without a means test or work requirement. And UBIs will be seen from this perspective as sort of a building block to reach a more dignified lifestyle. How to pay for that has been always the challenging context. Some discuss about the need for raising taxes. There could be wealth tax, there could be carbon tax, it could be a tax on financial transaction, it could be the Tobin tax, the Robin Hood tax, which include a digital tax. Some would suggest that tax is a bad idea, like the former Greek minister Yanis Varoufakis, who preferred to fund the universal income from a redistribution of corporate ownership. That's another way of thinking about that, and others even have offered other suggestions, such as free access to public services to warrant those essential needs. So whatever that might happen in this respect, we know that those arguments, which seems to be so radical when Claus Offe was talking about them, are getting more and more accepted in major international organizations. So the OECD recent reform of the international tax system, for instance, was accepted last month in the G20s and stand to replace unilateral measures such as digital service taxes, reallocating more than 125 billion of profit from the top multinationals enterprise to country worldwide. So interesting ideas that are out there, and for the sake of time, I'm just going to go over most of them in order to cover my 10,000 kilometers overview. The work of global civil society is certainly far from finished in that sense. In fact, I would suggest that initially, at the end of the after the dismantlement of the communist bloc, we saw sort of a re-energized global civil community or sphere that was convened, whether in the World Social Forum, later on in 2011 in Occupied Wall Street, to protest against the WTO, the G20, the World Economic Forum. That civil society has not been inactive with regard to global economic problems. But today, however, these movements have retrenched from the global scene, animated more by an anarchist tradition or leftist populism, and they have become more protectionism and ever more disjointed in the worldviews, in their worldviews and action. Now, in the West, one can say that collective action has been also fragmented by identity politics, which is an understandable reaction to the neglect or the exclusions of women, people of color, and indigenous population. But one needs to remember that the movement based solely on identity politics tend to fall short because the proposals are not embedded often in a broader and encompassing political project, and they are not really integrated and embedded in a more internationalist framework. And that usually makes those proposals vanish, and we see that the resurgent international phases within this respect could remain just merely aspirational. And so this takes me, and I'm just, for the sake of time, trying to go a little bit faster. I'm going to the fifth pillar, which is the universal right to mobility in a world of wars. So this is one of a major issues that we have today, and that but is not a new one. No one, as compared to human rights status of refugees to those of citizens, more eloquently than Hannah Arendt, the German political theorist, who in her origins of totalitarianism aptly had observed that 18th century recognition of inalienable human rights represented a turning point to human history. But what she also noted is that the right to citizens required and is protected by sovereign states. And when those rights are not there for people who are stateless, lacking their protections, they would lack protection, they would be deprived of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness or equality before the law, and freedom of opinion. This danger, Arendt pointed out, is that a global, universal, interrelated civilization may produce barbarians from its own midst by forcing millions of people into conditions which all disappearance, or which, despite all appearance, are the conditions, she writes, of savages. Now, the prophecy seems to be up because today we have over 82 million of people who have been displaced, and more than a quarter of them are refugees. So what is going to happen on that rim? Well, good news is that there are a lot of international documents to talk about that, a lot of them. I mean, quite a number. And here, just to mention a few, the New York Declarations for Refugees and Migrants in 2016 have 190 UN member states that recognize the needs for a comprehensive refugee status, with the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, and a variety of other international documents attempting to address the present issue of refugee rights. But because states, or no state, especially those that attract refugees only because of geographic proximity, can manage this burden on its own, one might consider broader regional and economic structure, some of which may already exist to manage the need of those forced to flee their home. So one of here, the point that I like to bring to your attention is the notions of regional cooperations framework. They have the benefit of shared migration and mobility patterns, common history, similar social economic patterns, language and cultural proximity that can favor consensus and agreement. We have such regional architectures out there, the EU, of course, with its flaws, but Latin American countries with liberal asylum and migrant mobility governments, even the GCC country in the Persian Gulf, but this is with a relative low mobility. Despite practical challenge, we have also the East African community and the economic community of West African states that are implementing comprehensive free movement regimes, both, of course, NAFTA and Asians, but they have a much higher skilled migrant mobility. But the whole principle is very interesting. I wrote quite extensively on this in my own book, The Levant Express, but it's something that I think can be broadened on the large global scale. The UNHCR anticipated that intergovernmental regional organization will need to be provided the financial and technical support for these pathways, along with, of course, data collections, while national authority will need to expand the size of resettlement programs. So sharing the burden, assisting in the restructuring of that burden is really one step in the right direction, I will suggest. Now, we know that with respect to civil society, which is an important element of pushing any of those arguments, it's actually weak because those common commitments are challenging, as well as the burden of civil society and the private sector. It is far from easy now, since the populism has gained attraction in civil society, and many now see the right of migrant mobility and refugee as antithetical to national citizens. So the progressive movement will need to rise to this occasion, I mean, in a more serious way, in a more sort of programmatic way, explaining the positive contributions of immigrants and defending their right in the public sphere, or looking for alternative if it's not in the home front. The last, and obviously not the least, is the universal right to health and in a bioengineering age. And I'm going to try to just go a bit faster on this. It's a very important one. The problem is known. We have a lack of universal health care. That's a very old problem. The pandemic has intensified centralized government, surveillance. The RNA, which has been sort of magical in a sense for the development of the vaccine, is also showing the possibility to manipulate and creating germline modification that might not be very advantageous, because those who have access to germline editings could actually create a human improvement or enhancements rather than simply remedy to disease. So this is one of the big problems with respect to that question, and trying to go a little bit faster to allow my colleague here to speak and to comment. I would just suggest that there is a lot of possibility in this realm, but what we have seen that is positive is the extraordinary scientific collaboration during the pandemic that was unprecedented and show what humanity can accomplish collectively in a short time. Today, the New York Times, I think, have even revealed that a COVID pill, the antiviral COVID pill, could be licensed in South Africa. It was a push by the UN. That sort of shows the possibility of major changes for the future, particularly in curtailing the advance of the disease. In conclusion, after reviewing all those challenges and attempting to come up with some solution, those are not certainly comprehensive solutions, those are the beginning of a conversation which I hope I will have with some of you in the future or now. I've concluded something, is that looking at all global civil society, the one that I found interesting is the environmental movement in the following way. First of all, because its posturing or its position to move a new democratic internationalist that could be galvanized by in different ways. First of all, it is better organized. It has gained broader political representation than other social movements. A Green New Deal connects in some way with each of the pillars I have already described. It invigorates internationalist collaborations, utilize broad digital platform if its exercise of free speech. It advocates for clean environments, spells out implications for sustainable development and economic sufficiency based on renewable energy, address the plight of climate refugees, and connect the environment to the universal right to health. So this pillar of a new internationalism are interconnected, are interdependent, and so for now, and I might be wrong about this, but for now, the new ecological movement seems to have that good position, good place in pushing those proposals forward. And so with that and with that hope, I am ending my remarks today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think you managed to do a perfect job in balancing the two things that need to be balanced. On the one hand, development of the solution for and ideas for obvious problems, the solution of problems. But at the on the other hand, you also focused on the problems of the solutions and how difficult it is to get them realized. Thereby drawing a sharp line, I think, between what we all should be busy with, namely thoughtful wishing, rather than wishful thinking. What we all have to ask ourselves when developing ideas for the solution, in this case of global or international problems, is address the question, how come that these widely acclaimed and compelling policy ideas have not been implemented long ago? What are the hindrances? What I would have liked to see is a distinction, a conceptual distinction between internationalism and globalization, or what Daniel Rodrik has called hyperglobalization. Internationalism leads to some form of global governance, right, as the term, widely used term today is, whereas hyperglobalization leads to anarchy of a global scale. Another question that I would like to bring up is what you speak of universal values, and sometimes you speak of Western values. I think the assessment of the capacity of our global system for universalism or universalization needs to be addressed in a skeptical way. Clearly, there is Kant 1795 on perennial peace. Peace is probably something that is most easily accepted as a universal value. But Kant rightly pointed out in one of the most successful hypotheses in the history of the social sciences, that the non-aggression or peaceful coexistence exists among republics. Not everyone is a republic. Therefore, universalism is a very demanding prescription. Let me just mention that China and Chinese intellectuals, to the extent we can make contact with them and discuss with them, reject the idea of universalism and instead cultivate the idea of what in the West is called the civilizational state. Every civilization, religious group, almost a reminiscence of Huntington, right, follows its own roots, its own tradition, its own religion, and basically also the Chinese tends to be the message. They cannot agree on anything that unites them because we are all rooted in this very different, deep tradition. Another question that I would like to bring up very briefly in my remarks, why democratic internationalism? I mean, it is quite obvious and has often been emphasized that democracy is a matter that takes place within states and not beyond states, not between states. And we in the European Union know exactly what it means to have a democratic deficit at the supranational level, where at best intergovernmental rather than federal principles can rule. Intergovernmental has nothing to do with democracy, and that is the Achilles heel of the European Union. International norms, however, differ very much from democratically adopted norms, legal norms within states. International norms are not legislated by a elected body. They are not easily, although partly, adjudicated, and they are very hard to enforce, international norms. If norms are complied with, they are implemented due to coalitions of the willing. The key term is voluntarism. States can decide whether or not they want to follow a norm, and it became evident in the COP26 conference that we just had, that truth-telling and promise-keeping cannot be enforced. I mean, what the United States proposed in 2015 is easily forgotten, and Jeffrey Sachs, you refer to him, has a very biting article on how much promises have not been kept, how many agreements have been forgotten, and the explanation he gives, if I may read one line, is America's broken and corrupt Congress remains in the pocket of big oil and big coal. That's the analysis of it. There is a typical dilemma that I would like to point out. On the one hand, President Biden comes to Glasgow, sorry, and preaches decarbonization, clean energy, and states his intention to get rid of oil and combustion engines and so on and so on, everything that is required for the sake of climate abatement or mitigation or whatever. On the other hand, he, at the same time, on the same day, he calls OPEC countries to increase oil production for the sake of economic recovery, and one may assume for the sake also of his own re-election next year, or in the midterm elections. There's a very remarkable essay by the German sociologist Niklas Luhmann with the title, "Why the Future Cannot Begin." Because before it can begin, we have more urgent, more short-term things to do than to think about the future. Policy analysts call that time inconsistency, you know. What needs to be done cannot be done because there are more urgent other things to be done. Therefore, it might be a good idea, and I fully agree, you had a few examples, to engage in regional internationalism rather than global, and do this in specialized regional agencies, such as in Europe, rather than all-purpose bodies like the UN or the League of Nations. There are huge distributional problems in international cooperation. Climate change is a perfect example. How do we distribute costs and benefits when climate change is caused and known to be caused by the rich north, and damages accumulate in the poor south? It is not a problem of mankind as a whole. It is a problem of redistribution in space, but also redistribution in time. Intertemporal distribution is something that comes up also in international law. The Stern report states the following of 2006 on the economics of climate change, states compellingly the problem that the longer we wait with radical measures to stop climate change, the less affordable becomes the solution in fiscal terms. It gets, the price doubles every 5 years, literally. But at the same time, we reach consensus only if we delay a solution, if we wait. But then the consensus is inoperative. I don't know how we'll get out of this, but whatever we need to do soon. But then we get the problem that the future cannot begin because other priorities intervene. Let me conclude by telling you a little anecdote. I happened to be in Argentina in September 1984 and had the opportunity to take part in this huge demonstration when the report of Ernesto Sabato was handed to President Augustine on the after the end of the military dictatorship, and on the report was on the fates of the desaparecidos, the 6,000 people who in Argentina had disappeared without any trace under the military dictatorship. This was a cheerful, enjoyable festivity of some 20,000 people assembled across the street from the Casa Rosada, the seat of the Argentinian president. And when the crowd dissolved and moved home in a cheerful mood, the Peronists had sprayed with red color on all the walls surrounding the place the words in Spanish, "You can't eat human rights." And that showed the deep division of the country in spite of the successful fight against the military dictatorship. How different local interests versus universal human rights have been. One last remark. I think it is debatable to count Hayek among internationalists. Hayek, in his famous essay from the late 30s, argued we need to internationalize in order to protect the market from the state and get it. That is globalization, and this is not internationalism. Thank you.
So first of all, let me thank both of you. Thanks, Micheline. Thanks, Claus, for the comment. I think you should first have the opportunity to comment on these very, very many points that Claus raised. I think there's a lot to do, Micheline. But let me just make this brief remark. As Ivan said in the beginning, we are back to lockdown in Austria, the 4th lockdown. We really tried our very best to quickly adopt to the new situation, to have this talk online. But I can really tell you the two who regret it most are here on stage. This is Micheline and Claus. They very much regret that they cannot be with you today here in the library and to discuss this with you. And to not have this talk in like a void I would especially like to ask our IWM community, please comment in the chat. I'm happy to read out your comments, and I think really both of them, Claus and Micheline, are very much looking forward to your comments, to your questions in the chat. Please post them and use this opportunity for a discussion with the two of them. Having said that, I'm now giving back to you, Micheline. I think this is there's many points that have been raised by Claus, quite diverse points as well. Please.
Yes, thank you very much for the comment, Claus Offe, and the opportunity to speak to this audience. So let me just start at first with the universal human rights. You're coming to my turf, so I have to just respond in that particular way. The contentions about universal human rights are not new. They're very old. So is it really universal? So that dated since 1948 with the first commissions of human rights. People just fighting the Chinese and the Lebanese and a number of people from different countries fighting and debating what is the universal criteria of right. I would submit to any challenge here when I say that I do not know one person, Chinese or from any other part of the world, who do not want to have due process when it comes to civil violations, who does not want to have some form of voice in a political process, who doesn't want some form of economic dignity or sufficiency, who would not want to have some form of security and protection by the states if left on her own, on his own, who wouldn't want to have some form of cultural expression, if possible, at any point in time. So any individual and any group, I would submit, would want that. Henceforth, I believe that those rights are universal. In fact, there's a strong position of Eleanor Roosevelt and the first commissions of human rights when she was really suggesting that at the end of the day, we can debate up till, no end, but that those are fundamental pillars, 5 fundamental pillars of right. And then the history shows that people have debated them, have disagreed, East and West value, cultural group versus Western values. But when you think about it, those are sort of like shared values discussed by the UNESCO. Shared values are really essential. How do you get about it and how do you make them happen is really the source of the contention. And that is really what you bring up to your second point, if I understand correctly. How do you enforce it? Well, this was always a problem. How do we enforce those values? If we were to agree that those are essential values and there are different problems to reach them, then how to enforce them? And it's true, there is no global governance that has the capacity to do what we would like to see that doing. But nonetheless, it is fair to say that in the 70-plus years after the declarations, universal declarations of human rights, we have seen some progress despite setbacks in the past 30 years. Certainly progresses in respect to the past 100 years before that. So I would like to just submit to the fact that without even those enforcement, global governments has played a role with stronger mechanisms, certainly after World War II, that was able to strengthen state capacity to do what it was not going to do on its own. So those mechanisms, whether they were Bretton Woods or NATO or the Marshall Plan or the UN, were strong mechanisms that changed and was a turning point in history. And we cannot simply say it because we don't have the compliance we wish, that we are back to 1919 or 1945. We are not. So there is some progress in that sense. The UNCAP promises, you're right, the United States particularly, and the West as well, have lost their credibility and their legitimacy, because even in the Gramscian sense, they cannot meet some of the processes, even in soft power terms, just in minimal way. They cannot meet sufficiently their commitment to liberal rights, to universal rights, and they are delegitimized as a result of that. You don't have to do all of it. You have to do a little bit more of it, and that will actually get a lot more followers. That is a problem, right? So, yes, the Trump withdrawal from all its commitment with all the mechanism of the alliances with the Western Europe has created another major crisis of the legitimacy of all those mechanisms. And actually, that is a big problem. So I would suggest that there is room for strengthening them. There is a lot of proposal of how to strengthen, but this is probably the time for those conversations rather than simply thinking that we are just going down the wrong way. You know, I think we should do more of it. And so that's the reason when I was discussing about some form of mechanism and processes to strengthen liberal internationalism, I was following up part of the positions of the post-World War II, NATO. Is NATO still viable? What do we do with NATO? Do we need hard power? Well, sometimes we need hard power to make soft power credible. So that's part of the reasons of how do you increase legitimacy, also from a regional perspective, as you seem to be more comfortable with this respect. There's so much more to say, and if there is question, I would certainly take on the question before I move on. But so
okay. Move on.
Move on. Okay. All right. I will move on. What does an hegemonic bloc means? This is really what I'm talking about. We talk about regionalism. What does an hegemonic bloc mean these days? Well, hegemonic bloc is a coalescence of countries which have similar values and understand that by coalescing together, that wedding their values and their interests, they could simply not import it in a colonial way, but they can import it and gain and solicit the goodwill of others. That is not happening, and this is sort of the reason why I'm thinking about from the structures of security in that sense. Trying to see if there is other question that you brought to my there's a number here.
Internationalism and globalization.
Internationalism and globalization. Thank you. I just noted it. So, yes, globalization is different from the internationalism, but in a way, you are actually adding to my comment, because when I say internationalism, I add the word democratic internationalism in order to make a bigger distinctions with globalization. Not that globalizations could not provide some form of democracy. This is sort of the Kantian argument. There is possibility for the free market to coexist with democracy. Marx himself said that he was for free trade. And, but the questions of how to re-regulate or create democratic regulatory processes where states would sort of abide by their commitment in order to make sure that we don't unravel in the world that we are seeing today. So globalization is correctly different. It's not politicized. There's a laissez-faire understanding. Laissez-faire is letting the free flow of the market to decide how there will be a trickle-down effects, and possibly, everybody will just take advantage of it. A democratic internationalism, at least the way I was trying to propose, is to suggest that there should be mechanism of regulations, and we need to find how to strengthen those mechanisms. You want to?
There was one maybe minor point brought up by Claus Offe towards the very end, Hayek as an internationalist.
Hayek an internationalist.
And I think one major point that I found very important, this was in reference to Kant's perpetual peace, when Claus Offe said that it is only republics that you can count on in international relations. So I think somehow it was the question, where do you take your optimism for international governments if we are faced with a world that does not, obviously not only consist of that kind of republics? I think this is the more nagging question.
Yes, it's a more difficult question. On the one hand, there is something to what Kant said, although they're very much disputed and contested, whether democracy are just, bring peace or are more sort of favorable to peace process and republic more to peace processes. No, it is true that this confederate argument, which was sort of designing what will be the world of tomorrow, suggests that there should be some form of regulatory. He didn't talk about supranational states, but he just suggested he did not move forward the principle to the one that we are facing today. We did not live in an interdependent world where we live today. Globalization was not penetrating every level of civil society the way it is today. Henceforth, the level of regulations have been enhanced and have to take it more seriously in consideration. I would just suggest something about Kant. He understood that history, and I would just put it differently, he understood one important thing, is that you cannot project the future by looking at history. If that was the case, then by inference, we would not have had the French Revolution. At the very same time, he suggested, even though if we cannot do inductive understanding about history, we can still see signs of progresses. And in his contest to faculty, since you're bringing back Kant, in the context of faculty, just sort of demolishing a lot of perspective of historiography, he suggested that perhaps let's look at those signs of progress. Now, how they are connected, dialectically, that's a different century that we're trying to resolve that, but nonetheless, the signs of progress is really my effort and my endeavor in this more humble process today.
Thank you, Micheline. Maybe let us come to an end at this point, and let me end on a short reference to the current situation in Austria. We started by saying that we had to adapt quickly to the new situation, and what we have seen recently, last year and over the first month of this year, was rather an internationalism of lockdown. I at least hope that this internationalism is not going to continue and to get bigger once again. This at least we can hope for. So thanks to our IWM team for adapting quickly to the new challenges. I understand that for all of us, especially for the two of you here on stage, it was not an easy situation. We have managed, this is good, and thanks to Nikki and everybody from the technical support at IWM. Thanks for all of you who joined online, and thanks for participating with the questions here. And most of all, thanks to Micheline Ishay and to Claus Offe. It was a pleasure. Good evening.